Nearly 97% of California's 6.2 million students started the 2021 school year from home. That despite the fact that 700,000 students did so without the technology they needed, whether it was internet access or a device. Is the digital divide widening the achievement gap? We'll ask. Cindy Johnson with EdSource, Toby Boyd, the president of the California Teachers Association, Amy Lee with the non-partisan California Legislative Analyst's Office, and Sunne McPeak, CEO of the California Emerging Technologies Fund.
From the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler. Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the wonderful company harvesting health and happiness around the world, California Emerging Technology Fund, and
Fresno State, where bold begins.
The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Era Energy LLC, BNSF Railway, E&J Gallo Winery, and Harris Ranch and Inn. Thank you.
The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way we approach a lot of things, perhaps no more so than in education. Our guest is Cindy Johnson with EdSource, perhaps the most authoritative source on K-12 education in California. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So California has really pushed online learning. How many students have been affected?
So without an exact figure of how many students are still without connectivity, we know that there are still hundreds of thousands of students that still either don't have devices or don't have internet access to their homes. The most recent figure that the California Department of Education has shared is 700,000 students. That's roughly 10% of California's 6 million student population, so a significant portion. One of the biggest issues contributing to that right now is that there's an enormous backlog globally of devices. So it's not so much a lack of effort to get these devices or a willingness to purchase them, but actually, there's 300,000 Chromebooks that are on back order from manufacturers.
I was going to ask you that. I mean, how's it been going with the school district? Is it going smoothly? How's the online experience going?
It's totally a mix. Some school districts that were able to kind of get up and going last spring quickly have had maybe a little bit more of a smoother transition. I've actually had the privilege to sit in some of these classes, and some teachers are really getting the hang of it. That said, it is a struggle, I think, for just about everyone involved. And knowing that there's still so many students just without the basic tools to log in has really meant that distance learning is not even an option for some students still. So it really varies by geography, by resources that your school has available already. We're really seeing a mix, as well as just what distance learning looks like. There's some schools that are doing hybrid schedules where cohorts of students will go in for a couple days, and then another cohort will go in a few days. And then you have other schools that are just doing completely virtual. So
it's interesting, because we at the university, we're online, and I was never a real positive about online. But I actually find that it actually makes me maybe even better because I can use technology as a way to kind of do a better job with my students. So I want to ask you, though, there are some teachers that are highly resistant to online teaching, and they're worried about being physically in a classroom. And there's been a bit of a backlash regarding that. What's the concern among teachers?
Yeah, I did a story on this recently, actually. There were several protests that started around the state where school districts were saying teachers had to conduct distance learning from their classroom. Now, don't get me wrong, there are several teachers, not several, but probably thousands of teachers that want to be in the classroom. So they have access to their materials, more stable Wi-Fi. But a lot of teachers, especially those who have some sort of pre-existing medical condition, were saying, what's the point of distance learning if we have to maybe expose ourselves more when we're on campus? What do we do with our own kids who are at home? So there was a lot of pushback to just that requirement of teachers having to show up on campus. A lot of the districts that I was reporting on for this story have actually gone back on that policy now and have given teachers the choice. If they want to go on campus for some reason, that's an option. They can do distance learning from the classroom. For those who are, maybe less comfortable with that, they can do it from home for now.
Yeah, it's obviously been a big issue. And the other thing, too, is caregivers, right? I mean, some of these teachers, not just their children, but they're maybe caring for their parents, and they're concerned about bringing something home to an elderly parent, and then that becomes an issue. I assume that in a lot of districts, that's going to be something that's going to be bargained between the teachers union and the school district. So based on your reporting here, we've got about 30 seconds left. I want to ask you about your impressions of how this experiment on online instruction, what has it really revealed, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really revealed that online learning or ed tech is really just a tool. It can never replace the act and the art of teaching, in person or, with humans. The best examples that I've seen are teachers who are really taking advantage of this online medium and doing things that they maybe wouldn't be able to do in person. And also showing that building relationships with families, with parents is going to be huge going forward, and has always been in education, but now that's really the key to student success. The other thing that I'll add is just it's revealed how much work we have to do around student privacy. A lot of districts are kind of rushing into deals with providers and really jumping into new ed tech agreements. But
Zoom had its own issues along that
exactly
as well. Well, I want to thank Cindy Johnson from EdSource. Great place we can look for information for K-12 education in California. Up next, we're going to talk with someone who's tasked with implementing distance learning. What do they think? And that person is going to be the California Teachers Association President, Toby Boyd. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. So what do teachers think about distance learning? We're fortunate to have as our guest the president of the California Teachers Association, Toby Boyd. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me.
So what is the consensus out there among teachers about online classes? Better or worse than in person?
Well, my educators are naturally, they want to do the obvious thing and be back in front of their students, because they understand that that is the best way to engage and to educate our students. But that's not what the world we're living in right now. We're living in a virtual world because we have to make sure it's safe for our students, for the educators to go back into the classroom. So until that happens, we are where we are, and that's exactly where we are.
It's a brave new world for sure. And with COVID, it really is pushing this whole idea of distance learning. It's accelerated. It was already happening, but it's certainly accelerated pretty tremendously. So what are the teachers' biggest concerns when it comes to distance learning?
There's several. It's health and safety of our students. As I will continue to preach and say, is that is the number one priority. The other concern is actually connecting with all of our students. It's closing that digital divide that's there, that's evident, that's present, that we have to make sure that we work on to make sure that the most vulnerable students, the students of color, the Black, Browns, the natives, have what they need in order to connect with the educators. That's one of the most concerning things that we have. So if anything, that's, we are worried about that, because we understand that not necessarily everyone has the ideal learning situation at home when they're there.
Yeah, one of the things I'm seeing is that it's not so much the devices are an issue for sure, but it's the connectivity that's a really big issue.
Well,
for a lot
both.
of these folks?
Because a third of our students are still without devices. And then if you add on to that the bandwidth and the connectivity that's missing, that makes the number even larger. But again, it's disproportionate in the Black and brown communities, also the rural communities. So we can't forget about them because they may not have the infrastructure out there.
Yeah, and I think that that's certainly true in places like the San Joaquin Valley, where you have both Black and brown people and obviously rural communities. But I wanted to ask you about some of the concerns about teachers' health. I wanted to just follow up on that. There are a lot of teachers out there, frankly, that are my age or older, that are concerned about what COVID might mean for them. They might be taking care of a parent. It's not just students obviously very important, but also the transmission to the teachers. Isn't that an issue for teachers?
Yes, it is. And that's a concern because the science is still out. We don't really know the exact proportion of our students and what the impact is. We do know, however, that children 11 and above actually have increased in positivity rates by 150%. So that is outrageously high. So then if you take that into account, if they come into the classroom and the educator has a parent or a multi-generational household that could possibly be affected by it, then that's our concern.
Which is truer and truer these days, right? Where
Yes.
where people are taking care of their parents.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you this.
And just yesterday, real quick, there was an incident up in the foothills about a student coming into the classroom and having tested positive for COVID, and now the educator and the students in the whole classroom are being quarantined.
Right. It can have a big effect. Let me ask you this, though. There's some that argue that teaching from a classroom has its advantage. So let's say things like better Wi-Fi connections, better tech support, better access to classroom materials. It gives students more of a feel of, really being in school by being in a physical location, or even in the teacher broadcasting from a classroom. What are your thoughts on that?
I feel that my educators are able to teach from whatever location they're in. If they have the tools at home, and most of them do, they'll be just as effective at home as it is with them in the classroom. And plus, we have to remember that some of our educators have children at home themselves, and they are doing the distance learning too. So we have to take that into account too.
Well, let me ask you one last thing. We've only got about 30 seconds left. I want to ask you real quickly about the public policy you'd like to see changed, maybe to make distance learning better for everyone.
Well, one, we need more funding, and that's the key. So part of the thing is that we have CTA and the coalition has Proposition 15 on the ballot. That's Schools and Communities First Initiative. That's going to bring money into the coffers of the schools. But we also need the HEROES Act to be passed from the federal government, which will help state, local, and school districts because we are short on funding. And that's what it is. And then we need to also think about new revenue streams that we can bring in from the state.
That's going to be an ongoing discussion for sure. Thank you very much for joining us today. Up next, we're going to hear the state response. This is Mark Kepler with the Maddy Report. Back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. So what's the state doing to make distance learning more accessible and more effective? We're fortunate to have an expert join us. Amy Lee is a Fiscal and Policy Analyst specializing in education issues with the Non-Partisan Legislative Analyst's Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me.
So what actions has the governor taken to ensure that local school districts are able to improve distance learning and broadband connections?
Well, in early March, the governor issued an executive order requiring public schools closed due to COVID to continue offering instruction. Primarily, this meant distance learning, which was a rather new forefront for most K-12 schools. So in response to some of these challenges, the governor required the California Department of Education to work with other state agencies to issue guidance, addressing key questions such as, what does effective distance learning look like? What are the best practices? What resources are available to help support this? Now, in terms of connecting students to the internet, the governor announced various partnerships with private organizations that had agreed to donate laptops, hotspot devices, or discounted internet service. He also directed $30 million in available state funds to help partially offset costs for student technology.
Yeah, so the state legislature also has a role to play here. What have they done to kind of improve distance learning and broadband capabilities?
Yep, that's right. So the state legislature, in working with the governor, provided additional funding for distance learning in the 2021 state budget. But with that came additional expectations. So for instance, the budget package establishes the requirements for distance learning, in essence, defining what distance learning is. This definition includes, among other activities, content that is substantially equivalent to in-person instruction, daily live interaction between teachers and students, providing appropriate learning supports for English learners, students with disabilities, and other student subgroups. Now, to help ensure that these requirements are being met, school districts are required to adopt what we call a learning continuity and attendance plan by September 30th. In this plan, districts will explain their approach to distance learning. How will they ensure that students have connectivity and have access to devices? How will they ensure continuity and instruction, whether that be through distance learning or in person? And what professional development opportunities will they offer teachers to help with remote teaching? Now, the intent here is by making districts go through the process of developing a plan, getting community feedback, districts will be more prepared to offer distance learning, ideally. Not only that, but districts can be held accountable to their plan.
Is this different than the LCAP?
So it's different from the LCAP, which is the Local Control and Accountability Plan. That is typically what districts have to fill on an annual basis to clarify how they're spending state funding for education. This year, because of the distance learning environment, we're actually substituting the traditional LCAP with the learning continuity and attendance plan. And the intent here is really that by making districts go through the process of developing a plan and getting community feedback, districts are more prepared to offer distance learning. But not only that, districts can be held accountable to this plan, very similar to the LCAP. Now, in terms of, yes.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
In terms of funding for distance learning, the budget provides districts $5.3 billion for the Learning Loss Mitigation Program. And most of this funding comes from the Federal CARES Act. This funding can be used on things such as laptops or hotspot devices and professional development to help support distance learning. And the allocation of this funding takes into consideration a district's special education, English learner, and low-income student populations. Now, the last thing I want to mention is the state budget also included some funding to develop statewide guidance for distance learning in the subjects of math, English language arts, and English language development.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at what, the different Senate bills, you had $1 billion in terms of the COVID response. A lot of it going to education. You've got $100 million out of Prop 98 money. They're putting a lot of money in this. It seems to me this is going to be, it's kind of a new frontier. I mean, I don't think distance learning isn't going anywhere. It sounds like it's going to be around post-pandemic. Sure looks that way. Let me ask, so you talked a little bit about the federal government. What are they doing in addition to the CARES Act? Can you talk a little bit about that, what they're doing?
Well, most of the federal government's response to COVID as it relates to K-12 education has come through the CARES Act itself, which was enacted in late March. As I previously mentioned, the bulk of the $5.3 billion for the Learning Loss Mitigation Program was one-time CARES Act funding. And the CARES Act also provided $1.5 billion one-time in grants to schools here in California, which could be spent on distance learning, technology for students, staff training, among other activities.
Yeah, when you're talking, give us this explanation. Our audience clearly knows why we have the LAO on a regular basis, because you guys really are on top of what's going on. I want to thank Amy Lee for that conversation on what the state and the federal government's doing in terms of this issue. Up next, we'll talk more about distance learning. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. K-12 education has undergone a transformational change as a result of distance learning. How do we make sure that the digital divide doesn't exacerbate our current achievement gap? Our guest is Sunne McPeak, the president and CEO of the California Emerging Technologies Fund, a fund that's leading the effort to close that digital divide. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to join you.
So, we talk about recent studies that they found that there's a pretty big disparity in educational impact of distance learning on major racial and ethnic subgroups and income levels. What is the California Emerging Technology Fund doing to address those disparities?
We are both addressing the policy challenge that you just identified with our representatives in Sacramento. We're working with the California Department of Education to raise the issue to the internet service providers, and we operate a major initiative called School to Home with the purpose of closing both the achievement gap as well as the digital divide.
So, you have a lot of experience, obviously, in state government. Not only are you from the Valley, but you were the Secretary of Business, Transportation, Housing in the Schwarzenegger administration, literally the biggest state agency. So you know how to maneuver through the bureaucracy. What policies and programs are you specifically advocating, not just at the state level, but maybe at the federal and local level as well?
As you know very well, and it is so highlighted in the San Joaquin Valley, the digital divide is just another manifestation of the economic divide and the opportunity divide. And those who are digitally disadvantaged are also disadvantaged in every other way. The pandemic has highlighted not just the digital divide, but I call it the digital cliff. People are falling off into deeper poverty, greater isolation, and we've got a challenge that is sort of twofold. One is in rural regions, rural communities such as the San Joaquin Valley, there's not adequate infrastructure in order to actually support distance learning. So we are working to get additional investment from the state through the California Advanced Services Fund. We're working with our policymakers. There was a big battle that just finished in the legislature at midnight on August 31. We'll have to go back and get that done well. The governor has called for broadband for all. He did it at the Economic Summit statewide in Fresno on November 8th. So he's leading this initiative called Broadband for All, but we've got to get money into it. And then secondly, we've actually got to get the internet service providers to make available affordable offers for low-income households that has adequate speeds and adequate data to support distance learning and telehealth, by the way.
Well, in some ways, this actually could be a positive for the Valley, right? If we can get, the digital divide closed in the Valley, it makes the lower cost of living in the Valley attractive to businesses, maybe to think about moving from the Bay Area to the Valley.
You are so right. And as you know, when I did work for the state, the Valley asked the Schwarzenegger administration and the legislature to focus on the San Joaquin Valley, establish the Partnership for the San Joaquin Valley. And we actually highlighted the San Joaquin Valley as the promise of the future of California, which is indeed true. As a Valley girl, farm girl, I just love the San Joaquin Valley. If we have adequate infrastructure that is high speed, it can support our residents working from everywhere in the Valley throughout not just California, but the rest of the country and world, and we will attract more capital investment. So we're working with CSU Fresno, Eduardo Gonzalez and the San Joaquin Valley Broadband Consortium. We're going to attract, our goal is to get about $43 million of investment in the next year committed to the San Joaquin Valley for infrastructure.
So that's pretty significant, and the California Partnership, which you led for a while, had a significant impact. It still has an impact going forward. But we've got about 10 seconds left. Real quickly, what can Central Valley school districts do to gain better access to broadband and to laptop devices?
They need to advocate for the investment of infrastructure. They need to demand from our policymakers in Sacramento that we support distance learning.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Sunne McPeak for joining us. It's great seeing you again. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us.